Imagine you are standing in a quiet Florentine counting house on a winter evening in the year 1290. The only sounds are the soft scratch of quill on parchment and the gentle clink of gold coins being sorted into careful stacks on tables covered in deep green counting cloth. A small fire crackles in the corner hearth, its warmth spreading slowly across cold marble floors, the flames casting dancing amber light that flickers across the whitewashed walls. The smell of oak smoke mingles with the scent of fresh ink and warm sealing wax, the distinctive fragrance of a place where money and records meet. Candles in iron holders burn steadily on heavy wooden tables, their light pooling on neat rows of gold florins arranged by denomination, each stack representing wealth beyond what most people will see in a lifetime. Outside, through narrow windows with small glass panes, the cobbled streets of Florence are settling into darkness, the last merchants closing their shops, the evening bells ringing from distant towers. Inside this counting house, clerks in long woolen robes bend over their ledgers, recording the day's transactions in careful Latin script with goose-quill pens, each stroke being deliberate, permanent, part of the endless patient work of early banking that continues as it has for decades, as it will for centuries to come. The quiet rhythm of commerce made visible through numbers and metal. Good evening. Welcome back. If you're new here, welcome. Tonight is a good night to rest. Find a comfortable position wherever you are. Dim the lights if you haven't already, or turn them off completely. Adjust your pillow until it feels just right. Maybe turn on a fan for soft background noise, or simply let the silence settle around you like a warm blanket. Let your breathing slow naturally. You're safe here. There's nothing urgent, nothing demanding your attention. You're safe here. Just the slow unfurling of history, told in a way that asks nothing of you except to listen, or to drift away, whichever feels right. Tonight we'll slowly explore the history of banking, from its quiet beginnings in medieval Italian merchant families to the vast complexity of modern central banks and digital finance. We'll see how gold coins and handwritten ledgers became the foundation of global commerce, how personal trust, sealed with wax, evolved into institutional systems spanning continents, how the simple act of keeping accounts transformed into the intricate machinery that underlies the modern economy. It's a long journey through 7 centuries, told slowly, with many details and atmospheric scenes from different eras, perfect for drifting off. If this story helps you rest, feel free to like or subscribe. I'm always curious where you're listening from, so if you feel like it, comment your city and what time it is there. But no pressure. Just relax and let the story carry you where it will. Now let us return to that Florentine counting house, but first to understand why such places emerged, why banking became necessary, we must step back in time to a harder, more physical world of commerce before these elegant systems existed. Imagine you are a wool merchant in England, the year 1150, standing in your workshop in a market town, perhaps Lincoln or Norwich, surrounded by bales of raw fleece waiting to be sold. The wool trade with Flanders is profitable, the Flemish weavers paying good silver for quality English wool, but moving that payment back to England is the constant problem that shapes your life. You've just completed a sale, receiving payment in Flemish groats, heavy silver coins that now sit in a leather pouch in your hands, the weight being substantial, perhaps £5 of silver for a modest transaction, much more for larger deals. The pouch is heavy in your grip, the leather worn smooth from use, the coins shifting and clinking with each movement. You can feel the individual coins through the leather, each one being roughly cut, slightly irregular, the silver content varying depending on which Flemish city minted them. To take this money home, you must carry it yourself, or trust it to someone else, either option being dangerous. The roads between Flanders and England are long and uncertain, bandits being common, especially on forest roads where travellers are vulnerable, ambush being easy, escape being difficult. You could hire armed guards, mercenaries, who will protect your coin caravan for a fee, but their wages eat into your profits, and you must trust them not to simply take the money themselves once you're far from witnesses. The alternative is hiding the coins in various places in your baggage, hoping thieves won't find them all, the anxiety of this being constant, making sleep difficult during the journey, every sound in the night being a potential threat. The physical reality of money being metal means commerce is limited by what can be safely carried, by what armed men can protect, by what risks merchants are willing to accept. The journey itself takes weeks, the channel crossing being unpredictable, storms delaying ships for days, the sea voyage being uncomfortable and sometimes dangerous, the coins adding weight to baggage that must be watched constantly. Upon reaching England, you must then exchange Flemish silver for English pennies, the money changers in port towns charging substantial fees, testing each coin for purity, weighing them carefully, always taking their percentage, their profit coming from your need for local currency. The exchange rate is never favourable, the money changers knowing you have no choice, their scales being calibrated to their advantage, though you can rarely prove it. Back home in your town, you hide the remaining coins in various places, some under floorboards, some in hollow spaces in walls, some buried in the garden, the distribution being insurance against total loss if thieves break in. You tell no one exactly where all the money is hidden, not even family entirely, the paranoia being reasonable given the reality of theft. There is no bank to deposit this wealth, no institution you can trust more than your own hiding places, no way to keep money safe except through concealment and vigilance. This is the world before banking, where commerce is limited by the physical constraints of metal money, where merchants must be armed guards as much as traders, where growth is restricted by what can be physically moved and protected. The inefficiency is enormous, the risk is constant, the cost is substantial. Trade happens despite these obstacles, not because of any system designed to facilitate it, and everyone involved understands that there must be a better way, though what that way might be remains unclear in this 12th century world of physical wealth and physical danger. Time passes, the decades accumulate, the 13th century arrives, and with it something new begins emerging in certain Italian cities, particularly Florence and Venice, where merchants trading across the Mediterranean and into northern Europe face these same problems of moving money, but begin developing solutions, clever workarounds that will eventually transform into banking as we would recognise it. You now find yourself in Florence in the year 1290, the same counting house from our opening scene, but now you understand it better, seeing how it functions, what purpose it serves. The building sits on a narrow street near the Ponte Vecchio, the old bridge across the Arno River, the location being strategic, close to the heart of commercial Florence, where merchants congregate, where deals are made, where money changes hands constantly. The ground floor is the counting house itself, a single large room with a vaulted ceiling supported by stone columns, the marble floor being cold even in summer, frigid in winter, the chill being somewhat offset by the fire that burns in the corner hearth during cold months. The tables are arranged in rows, each covered with green woolen cloth, stretched tight and nailed along the edges, the green providing a surface against which gold and silver coins stand out clearly, making counting easier, reducing errors. The tables are scarred from years of use, knife marks where clerks have tested coin edges, ink stains where pens have leaked, wax drippings from countless candles burned during long evening sessions balancing accounts. The benches where clerks sit are simple wooden affairs, worn smooth by decades of use. The word banco, meaning bench in Italian, the origin of the English word bank lying in these simple wooden seats where financial business is conducted. The clerks themselves are young men, typically sons of lesser merchant families, learning the trade of commerce and accounting, their futures depending on mastering these skills. They wear woolen robes dyed in dark colours, practical clothing for long hours of sedentary work, their hands being ink-stained, their posture being bent from leaning over ledgers, their eyes being tired from working by candlelight. The scratch of their quill pens is nearly constant during business hours, the sound being rhythmic, almost musical, punctuated by the occasional clink of coins being counted or the rustle of parchment being unfolded. The coins being counted are mostly gold florins, the famous currency of Florence, first minted in 1252 and now recognised across Europe for their consistent purity and weight. Each florin contains 3.5 grams of pure gold, the city's reputation depending on maintaining this standard, counterfeiters being punished severely, the trust in Florentine currency being the foundation of the city's commercial power. The florins are sorted by condition, newer coins with sharp edges being kept separate from worn ones that have circulated for decades, each stack being counted twice to ensure accuracy, the totals being recorded in the ledgers with careful notation of condition and origin. The merchant banker who owns this establishment sits at a larger table at the back of the room, his clothing being finer than his clerks', his manner being more authoritative, his attention being divided between several conversations and the general supervision of the work being done. His name might be Bardi or Peruzzi, families that are establishing themselves as the great banking houses of medieval Florence, their fortunes being built on combining trade with financial services, moving goods and money across Europe, lending to princes and kings, taking deposits from wealthy clients who trust them more than they trust their own security arrangements. The banking here is still primitive by later standards, but it represents crucial innovations. The merchant banker accepts deposits, keeping the gold in a strong box in a locked room upstairs, iron-banded and secured with multiple locks, the keys being kept separately by different trusted employees, the security being as sophisticated as medieval technology allows. Depositors receive written receipts, parchment documents sealed with wax, acknowledging the amount deposited and promising to return it on demand, the paper being far easier to carry than gold, though still requiring the physical return to this specific counting house to redeem. More importantly, the merchant banker makes loans, though the church prohibits usury, the charging of interest on money being considered a sin, exploitation of the needy being forbidden by canon law. The solution is semantic and clever. Loans are disguised as commercial transactions with fees rather than interest, payments for the service of providing capital rather than the lending of money itself. A merchant needing funds might sell future wool deliveries to the banker at a discount, receiving gold immediately and delivering wool later. The difference being profit rather than interest, the church being satisfied by this technical distinction, the economic function being identical to a loan. Though medieval bankers charged fees rather than interest to avoid usury laws, a semantic distinction modern accountants would find familiar, the practice of finding creative ways to charge for money's use being ancient and persistent. The double-entry bookkeeping being practiced here is revolutionary, though the clerks performing it might not realise it. Every transaction is recorded twice, once as a debit and once as a credit, ensuring that accounts balance, that no error can hide for long, that the books can be audited and verified. This method, being developed and refined in Italian merchant houses through the 13th and 14th centuries, will eventually spread across Europe and become the standard accounting practice worldwide. but here in 1290 it is still relatively new, still being perfected, the systematic recording of every florin's movement being the foundation of trustworthy banking. The rhythm of the banking day follows the sun and the bells of Florence's churches. The counting house opens at dawn, clerks arriving to prepare for the day's business, lighting candles, arranging the counting cloth, retrieving the previous day's ledgers from locked cabinets, reviewing where accounts stand. Clients begin arriving mid-morning, merchants depositing proceeds from sales, others withdrawing funds for purchases, some seeking loans disguised as exchange transactions, the banker listening to proposals, assessing creditworthiness based on personal knowledge and reputation, the decision to lend being as much about character judgment as financial calculation. The afternoon sees less client traffic but more internal work, clerks recording the morning's transactions in permanent ledgers, calculating running balances, preparing summaries for the banker's review, the careful work of maintaining accurate records being essential, errors being caught and corrected, discrepancies being investigated, the books being expected to balance perfectly at day's end. As evening approaches and natural light fades, candles become necessary, the cost of beeswax or tallow being significant but unavoidable, the work continuing into darkness during busy periods, the clerk's eyes straining in the flickering light, squinting at numbers written in increasingly tired handwriting. The closing ritual is precise and methodical. All coins handled during the day are recounted, comparing the physical total with the ledger entries, any discrepancy requiring explanation before anyone can leave, the responsibility for accuracy being serious, a clerk's career depending on reliability. The gold is carried upstairs to the strongbox, the weight being substantial, 2 men typically carrying the locked chest between them, the stairs being narrow, the process being careful and deliberate. The strongbox is secured with multiple locks, each key being held by a different senior clerk, no single person being able to access the vault alone, the precautions against theft being layered and thorough. The ledgers are locked away in wooden cabinets, themselves secured with iron bands and padlocks, the records being nearly as valuable as the gold, the information they contain being the foundation of the business, the trust of clients depending on the reliability of these accounts. The fire is banked for the night, reducing to coals that will be easier to restart tomorrow. The candles are extinguished, the windows are shuttered and barred, the door is locked with a heavy key that the banker carries home, and the counting house settles into darkness, the day's work complete, the cycle ready to begin again tomorrow. Decades pass in this rhythm, the counting houses of Florence becoming more numerous, more sophisticated, more central to the city's economy. The Bardi and Peruzzi families emerge as dominant forces, their branches extending across Europe, from London to Naples, from Bruges to Constantinople, a network of counting houses all operating on the same principles, all keeping accounts in the same double entry system, all connected by a web of trust and mutual obligation that makes them collectively more powerful than any single operation could be. But Florence is not alone in developing banking. Venice, the great maritime republic controlling trade routes to the east, develops its own banking system, somewhat different in character but serving similar functions. You find yourself in Venice in the early 1300s, standing in a banco at the Rialto, the commercial heart of the city, where the Grand Canal makes a dramatic bend, and merchants gather to trade in goods arriving from across the Mediterranean and beyond. The Venetian banco is similar to the Florentine counting house, but adapted to Venice's unique circumstances. The room is at ground level, directly on the canal, accessible by water as well as by the narrow streets that thread through the city, gondolas pulling up to discharge merchants arriving with bags of coins or documents to exchange. The dampness from the canal is constant, the smell of salt water mixing with the usual scents of ink and wax, the humidity being hard on parchment and wooden furniture, everything being slightly damp, slightly mouldy, the price of Venice's aquatic existence. The Venetian bankers specialise particularly in exchange, Venice's role as middleman between East and West creating constant need to convert between Byzantine hyperpyra, Islamic dinars, Italian florins, and dozens of other currencies, each with different gold or silver content, each requiring careful weighing and testing. The exchange rates being complex and constantly shifting based on the relative abundance of different coins and the political situations affecting their minting. The skill of a Venetian exchange banker lies in knowing these rates, in having samples of every major coinage for comparison, in being able to quickly calculate fair exchanges that leave both parties satisfied while generating profit for the banco. The record keeping is similarly meticulous, though Venetian style differs slightly from Florentine practice, the specifics of double entry being adapted to local needs and preferences, the underlying principle being the same. Every transaction must be recorded twice, debits equaling credits, the books balancing at the end of each day, the systematic nature of the accounting being what makes banking trustworthy, what allows it to scale beyond what any single person could track in their memory. Now, in this early 14th century world of established Italian banking, something new emerges that will transform how money moves across distances, solving the fundamental problem that plagued our 12th century wool merchant: how to transfer value without moving metal. The instrument is called a bill of exchange, and though it seems simple, almost obvious in retrospect, it represents a conceptual breakthrough that will enable international commerce to grow beyond what physical transport of gold and silver could support. Imagine you are a Florentine cloth merchant in the year 1320 planning to purchase wool in England and sell it in Florence. The traditional method would require carrying gold to England to pay for the wool, then shipping the wool back to Florence, the gold being heavy and vulnerable to theft, the whole process being expensive and dangerous. The bill of exchange offers an alternative, an elegant solution that eliminates the need to physically transport precious metal. You visit your banker in Florence, a Peruzzi counting house near the Ponte Vecchio, the familiar green-clothed tables and scratching quills creating an atmosphere of quiet commerce. You explain your need, funds in London to purchase wool. The banker nods, understanding immediately, this being a common request. He takes a piece of fine parchment cut to standard size and begins writing in careful Latin script, using a formula that has become standardized across European banking, the words being specific and legally meaningful. The bill states that the Peruzzi Bank in London shall pay a specified sum in English pounds, sterling to you or your representative upon presentation of this document, the amount being calculated from the florins you are depositing in Florence according to the current exchange rate between Florentine and English currency. The banker signs the bill, presses his seal into warm red wax, the distinctive design of the Peruzzi family creating a unique identifier, forgery being possible but difficult and dangerous given the penalties. You pay the banker the agreed amount in florins plus a fee for the service, the fee being calculated as a percentage of the transaction, typically 3 to 5% depending on the distance and risk involved. The paper you receive, folded and sealed, weighs almost nothing compared to the gold it represents, can be carried in an inner pocket, presents no obvious target for thieves who wouldn't recognize its value even if they found it. You travel to England by the usual routes, ship across the Channel, the journey taking weeks, but the bill travels with you safely, No armed guards needed, no anxiety about robbery, except the minor concern about losing the document itself, which would require returning to Florence for a replacement, inconvenient but not catastrophic. Upon reaching London, you visit the Peruzzi branch there, a counting house in the merchant quarter near the Thames, similar in arrangement and atmosphere to the Florence original, the green tables and careful clerks being reassuringly familiar. You present the bill, the London clerk examines it carefully, verifies the seal, confirms that the document appears legitimate, then counts out the specified amount in English silver pennies, the local currency, heavy coins that you will use to purchase wool from English merchants, the transaction being complete, the value having been transferred from Florence to London without any gold crossing the channel, the magic of paper finance replacing the burden of metal transport. The mechanics behind this apparent magic are straightforward but require trust networks spanning countries. The Florence Peruzzi branch and the London Peruzzi branch are part of the same family enterprise, their accounts being consolidated, money flowing between them based on business needs rather than every individual transaction. When you deposited florins in Florence, those florins stayed in Florence, being used for other purposes or added to the bank's reserves. When you withdrew pounds in London, those pounds came from the bank's London reserves, built up through their ongoing English business. The bill of exchange merely balanced accounts between branches, the physical gold staying in place, only the accounting entries moving. This system works because the Peruzzi, like other major Italian banking families, have regular business in both cities, money flowing in both directions for various reasons. If one branch temporarily has less metal than needed, they borrow from other bankers in that city, the international banking community being surprisingly cooperative because everyone benefits from the system functioning, everyone's business depending on credit networks remaining intact. The bills of exchange create a web of obligations, promises to pay, relationships of trust that collectively allow commerce to occur at scales impossible if every transaction required physical gold transport. The additional genius of bills of exchange, though perhaps unintentional initially, is that they technically avoid the usury prohibition that complicates medieval lending. A bill of exchange is not a loan, but a currency exchange. You are not borrowing money, but converting florins to pounds. The time delay between deposit and withdrawal being incidental to the exchange function. That the exchange rate might be manipulated to include hidden interest, that the 90-day bill might have a different rate than immediate exchange, creating a profit for the banker that functions exactly like interest, is a detail that the Church generally overlooks, the economic function being served without violating the letter of canon law, the semantic flexibility being useful for everyone involved. The bill of exchange proliferates rapidly through the 14th century, becoming standard practice among merchants, the volume of international trade increasing dramatically as the necessity of armed gold transport diminishes, the risk and cost of commerce declining, the velocity of money increasing, as the same gold can support multiple transactions through the multiplication effect of credit. The Italian bankers who perfected this instrument grow wealthy and powerful, their services being essential to kings and popes as well as merchants, their networks spanning Europe, their accounts tracking obligations that total far more than all the gold in their vaults, the beginnings of fractional banking being visible though not yet formalized or fully understood. But perhaps no Italian banking family rises higher or becomes more legendary than the Medici, whose bank, founded at the very end of the 14th century, will come to dominate European finance for much of the 15th century, their wealth and power becoming so great that they transform from bankers into princes, their patronage shaping the Renaissance itself, their palace becoming the centre of Florentine culture as well as commerce. You now stand in Florence in the year 1430, but this is a different Florence than the one we visited in 1290. The city has grown wealthier, more magnificent, the profits of banking and trade being invested in art and architecture, the cityscape being transformed by construction projects funded by merchant families competing to demonstrate their status through patronage and display. You approach the Palazzo Medici on the Via Larga, the great house that Cosimo de' Medici, the current head of the Medici Bank, has recently completed. A massive stone building that combines the functions of family residence and banking headquarters, the architecture being both beautiful and defensive, the ground floor being rusticated stone that appears almost fortress-like, while upper floors are decorated with elegant windows and classical details. The banking hall is on the ground floor, accessible through a great door that opens onto an arcaded courtyard, the space being larger and more impressive than the simple counting houses of earlier generations, the success of the Medici being visible in every expensive detail. The walls are frescoed with scenes of classical virtue and Medici family history, the message being that the family's wealth is deserved, earned through talent and hard work rather than mere fortune. The floor is not plain marble but elaborately patterned with coloured stones, the expense being enormous, the effect being to inspire confidence that this is an institution of permanence and substance. The tables are still covered with green counting cloth, the practical requirements of banking being unchanged, but the cloth is finer, probably silk rather than wool, and the tables themselves are masterworks of joinery, carved and polished, the surfaces being smoother than the scarred work tables of earlier generations. The clerks wear better robes, some in silk rather than wool, the prestige of working for the Medici allowing them to dress above their station, their association with the family elevating their own status. Cosimo de' Medici himself moves through the hall periodically, overseeing operations, his manner being quiet and controlled, not flashy or aggressive, his power being so great that he needs not display it obviously. He is not yet officially the ruler of Florence, the city still being theoretically a republic, but his wealth and the network of obligations he has created through shrewd lending and careful patronage make him effectively the city's master, his approval being necessary for most important political decisions, his enemies finding themselves unable to act against him because too many powerful people owe him money or favours. The Medici Bank operates on a more sophisticated model than earlier banking houses. Rather than being a single enterprise with branches, it is structured as a network of legally separate partnerships, each branch being formally independent, having its own capital and bearing its own risks, though all being controlled by the Medici family, who are senior partners in each. This structure limits risk, a failure in one location not necessarily bringing down the whole enterprise, while maintaining central control over strategy and major decisions, the legal complexity being another innovation, another layer of sophistication added to the practice of banking. The bank's business is diversified across activities and geographies. There are branches in Rome, Venice, Geneva, Bruges, London, Barcelona, each serving local markets while being part of the larger network, money flowing between them as needed, the bills of exchange creating a continuous circulation of credit and obligation. The bank accepts deposits from wealthy clients across Europe, the Medici reputation for reliability making them a trusted repository for noble and merchant wealth, the deposits providing capital for the bank's lending operations. The lending itself takes many forms, the prohibition on usury requiring creativity and flexibility. Loans to merchants are disguised as currency exchanges, as with bills of exchange. Loans to princes and kings are structured as advance purchases of future tax revenues or commodity deliveries, the repayment including hidden interest through manipulated prices. Loans to the Pope, the Medici being papal bankers, are covered by fees for managing church finances and collecting revenues across Christendom. The Church's vast income requiring sophisticated financial management that the Medici provide in exchange for substantial compensation. The record-keeping is elaborate and sophisticated, multiple sets of books being maintained, the main ledgers recording all transactions in double-entry format, subsidiary books tracking specific types of business, secret books in cipher recording sensitive transactions that the Medici prefer to keep private. The complexity of the accounting being both a strength and a potential vulnerability. The system working as long as the people maintaining it are trustworthy and competent, failure of either quality being potentially catastrophic. The daily rhythm in the Medici Palace combines banking routine with political and cultural activities that blur into each other. Morning sees clients arriving to conduct financial business, deposits and withdrawals and loan negotiations, the clerks processing these transactions with practiced efficiency. Afternoon might bring scholars and artists seeking Medici patronage, Cosimo being a great patron of learning and art, his support being crucial for many Renaissance figures. The meetings about commissioned paintings or architectural projects happening in the same rooms where banking business is conducted, the connections being direct between financial power and cultural patronage. Evening sees the balancing of books, a process that in a banking operation as large as the Medici's requires hours of careful work. Senior clerks reviewing the day's transactions, comparing them against running totals, investigating any discrepancies, preparing summaries for Cosimo's morning review, the accuracy being critical, errors being unacceptable, the clerks' reputations depending on their reliability. The gold and silver is counted and secured in the palace vaults, massive iron-bound chests in locked rooms on upper floors, the keys being distributed among trusted family members and senior employees. The security being taken seriously, the knowledge that the Medici fortune rests partly in these vaults being motivation enough for careful protection. But also the evening brings social gatherings, Cosimo hosting dinners for important clients and political allies, the conversations mixing business and pleasure, loans being discussed over wine, political arrangements being made while discussing art, the integration of banking into the social fabric of Florentine elite society being complete, the banker being also a politician, patron, diplomat, the roles being inseparable at this level of wealth and influence. The Medici Bank's success rests on several foundations beyond mere financial skill. Their papal connection is crucial, being bankers to the Pope, giving them access to church revenues from across Europe, providing both capital and credibility. Their religious association being ironic given that charging interest is technically sinful, but the Church needing sophisticated financial services just as secular princes do, the pragmatic reality overcoming theoretical prohibition. Their political power in Florence allows them to shape policy to support their business interests, trade agreements being negotiated to benefit Medici commerce, competitors being disadvantaged through regulatory pressure, the close connection between political and financial power being characteristic of the era. Their diversification into manufacturing, particularly silk and wool textiles, provides multiple revenue streams and creates vertical integration, the bank financing purchases of raw materials, the Medici manufacturing businesses producing finished goods, the bank financing sales to distant markets, profits accruing at every stage, the industrial and financial operations reinforcing each other. Their careful cultivation of reputation through patronage and philanthropy and public works creates the social capital that makes others willing to trust them with deposits and loans. the Medici name becoming synonymous with reliability and success, the brand value being as important as the physical gold in the vaults. But the Medici Bank, despite its sophistication and success, also demonstrates the fragility of medieval banking, the way these institutions rest on foundations that can crumble if confidence fails or if key decisions prove wrong. The bank's decline, when it comes in the later 15th century, results from overextension, particularly loans to princes who default or delay payment, the difficulty of collecting from powerful borrowers being eternal, the danger of lending to those who can refuse to pay being underappreciated until losses mount. Remember those Florentine bankers exchanging letters instead of gold? Now, the Medici Bank operates branches across Europe, but still the system depends on trust and personal relationships. Still, the fundamental vulnerability remains that promises to pay are only as good as the willingness and ability to honour them. Still, the magic of credit can reverse into disaster if too many obligations come due simultaneously and cannot be met. The fragility becomes starkly visible when we look at what happened to earlier banking houses, particularly the great failures of the 14th century that preceded the Medici rise. You find yourself in Florence in the year 1340, standing outside the locked doors of the Bardi Bank, once one of the greatest banking houses in Europe, now ruined, its failure sending shockwaves through the Florentine economy and beyond, the lesson being harsh but clear about the dangers of banking even when practiced by the most sophisticated institutions of the age. The Bardi failure resulted from overlending to Edward III of England, the king financing his wars against France through loans from Italian bankers, the sums being enormous, far beyond what the Bardi could afford to lose, but royal clients being too prestigious to refuse, too powerful to discipline, the expectation being that kings ultimately pay their debts because their credit is their power. But Edward defaulted, simply refusing to repay what he owed, the distance making enforcement impossible, the Bardi having no recourse against an English king, the losses being catastrophic. The Bardi Bank had been operating on fractional reserves like other banks, their deposits exceeding their gold holdings by substantial margins, the difference being lent out, the system working as long as depositors didn't all withdraw simultaneously. But news of the English default created panic, depositors rushing to withdraw their money, the Bardi counting houses being besieged by crowds demanding their gold, the guards at the doors trying to maintain order, the clerks inside desperately counting out coins, the reserves being depleted hour by hour, the bank's gold running out while obligations remained, the mathematical inevitability of fractional reserve banking when confidence collapses becoming visible. The scene is calm in a melancholy way, not violent but inexorable, depositors waiting in queues that extend down the street, some having camped overnight to be early in line, understanding that first to withdraw will get paid, while later arrivals will find empty vaults. Inside the counting house, the senior partners review their books, the ledgers showing clearly that liabilities far exceed assets, that even selling everything they own, their personal fortunes, their palace, their businesses, couldn't satisfy all depositors, that the bank is insolvent, that continuing to pay out their dwindling gold only delays the inevitable while impoverishing themselves personally. They close the doors, refusing further withdrawals, the decision being rational but devastating, depositors who trusted them with life savings finding themselves holding worthless receipts, the paper promises being exposed as exactly that, promises that cannot be kept, trust that was misplaced. The political and economic consequences ripple through Florence and beyond, other banks facing runs as confidence in the entire system erodes, credit seizing up as lenders hoard gold rather than extending loans, merchants unable to finance their trade, workers being laid off as businesses contract, the depression being deep and prolonged, the human cost of banking failure being widespread and severe. The Peruzzi Bank fails around the same time for similar reasons: overlending to the English crown, overextending on fractional reserves, facing runs they cannot survive, the pattern being repeated, the lesson being learned painfully by the Florentine banking community. Lending to princes is dangerous. Fractional reserves create fragility. Trust is essential, but can evaporate instantly. Banking creates wealth, but also creates risk that can destroy both bankers and their clients. Yet banking continues, phoenixes rising from the ashes of failed institutions, new families learning from the mistakes of predecessors, the Medici among them, their rise being built partly on the ruins of the Bardi and Peruzzi, their initial conservatism being reaction to those failures, their later problems being proof that the lessons are eventually forgotten, the cycle continuing, banking crises being as much a pattern of history as banking success, the two being inseparable, the creation of credit being always accompanied by the potential for catastrophic collapse when that credit proves unfounded. The story continues forward through centuries of evolution and crisis, of innovation and failure, of systems growing more sophisticated while fundamental vulnerabilities persist. But rest comes easier knowing that these patterns are old, that humans have been grappling with these questions for 700 years, that the patient work of banking, the quiet scratch of pens recording transactions, the careful counting of coins, the balancing of books at day's end, continues through crisis and calm, adaptation and repetition, the machinery of finance being resilient if not always reliable, essential if not always trustworthy. The long history being one of gradual progress punctuated by periodic disasters, the rhythm being almost predictable, almost comforting in its consistency. The human story of money and trust playing out across centuries in variations on timeless themes. Centuries have passed since those Florentine counting houses and the rise and fall of the Medici Bank. The world of the early 17th century is different in many ways from medieval Florence. The Reformation having fractured Christian unity, the discovery of the Americas having transformed trade and monetary flows, the rise of nation-states having changed the political landscape. But banking remains fundamentally similar, still based on personal trust, still vulnerable to runs and failures, still lacking institutional frameworks that might provide stability and reliability beyond what individual merchant bankers can offer. You now find yourself in Amsterdam in the year 1609, standing before a new kind of institution that will help solve some of banking's persistent problems while creating new opportunities and challenges. The city of Amsterdam has become Europe's commercial centre, displacing Venice and rivaling London, the Dutch Republic's dominance of seaborne trade creating wealth that flows through the city's canals and warehouses and exchange banks, the golden age of Dutch commerce being built on innovations in shipping, finance and corporate organisation. The Bank of Amsterdam, the Wissel Bank, opens in 1609 as a municipal institution owned by the city rather than private merchants, the public character being deliberate, an attempt to create an institution more stable and trustworthy than private banks which have failed repeatedly, leaving depositors ruined and commerce disrupted. The bank is housed in the basement of the town hall on Dam Square, the central plaza of Amsterdam, the location being both practical and symbolic, the city's authority backing the bank's promises, the physical connection between government and finance being made concrete in the architecture itself. Imagine you descend the stone steps into the bank's vaulted chambers beneath the town hall, the air being cool and slightly damp despite the fires burning in corner hearths, the smell being of stone and metal, and the unique scent of money in quantity. thousands of coins in various states of cleanliness, creating a distinctive metallic aroma. The ceilings are low-barrel vaults of brick and stone, the space being divided into sections by thick walls, some areas for receiving deposits, others for the vaults where coins are stored, the security being substantial, iron gates and multiple locks, armed guards stationed at key points, the city's treasure being protected as carefully as any private merchant would protect their own. The innovation of the Bank of Amsterdam is not so much in technique as in scale and standardization. The bank accepts deposits in any of the dozens of different coins circulating in Amsterdam. The city being a crossroads of trade, coins arriving from across Europe and beyond, Spanish silver reals, German thalers, English shillings, French livres, Italian ducats, each with different weights and silver contents, each being clipped or sweated or debased to varying degrees, the confusion and uncertainty about coin values being a major obstacle to smooth commerce. The bank solves this by assaying each deposit carefully, testing purity and weighing precisely, then crediting depositors with bank money, standardized units of value backed by the actual metal content of their deposits. The bank money being more reliable than physical coins because it represents guaranteed silver content rather than nominal face values of uncertain coins. The depositors receive receipts, written acknowledgements of their bank money balances, but more importantly, they can transfer these balances to other account holders without any physical coins changing hands. The clerk simply debiting one account and crediting another in the massive ledgers where all accounts are recorded. You watch as a merchant conducts a transfer, what the Dutch call a giro transfer, the term coming from Italian banking practices but now formalized and scaled by the Amsterdam Bank. The merchant approaches a clerk's desk, one of several arranged along the walls of the main chamber, each desk having ledgers and writing materials, ink wells and quill pens, the implements of record keeping being the same as in the Medici counting houses, but the scale being larger, the number of accounts being in thousands rather than dozens. The merchant identifies himself and the person to whom he wishes to transfer funds. The clerk locates both accounts in the ledgers, massive bound volumes organized alphabetically, the pages being thick parchment that can withstand years of entries and corrections, the entries being made in careful script with standardized abbreviations and symbols, the accounting language being precise and universal among the clerks who maintain these books. The clerk writes the transfer in both accounts, debiting the payer and crediting the payee, the amounts being noted in bank florins, the standardized unit, the transaction taking only minutes, the transfer being complete without any coins being moved, without any verification of coin purity, without the complications of exchange rates between different currencies. The simplicity and efficiency of this system attracts merchants and becomes the preferred way to settle large transactions in Amsterdam. The alternative being to physically deliver heavy bags of mixed coins, spend hours sorting and testing and weighing, negotiate exchange rates, bear the risk of theft during transport. The Giro system eliminating all these frictions, making commerce smoother and faster, creating network effects as more merchants open accounts to transact with each other, the bank money becoming in effect a new currency, more trusted and convenient than physical coins despite being merely ledger entries backed by metal in the vaults. The Bank of Amsterdam operates with substantial reserves, the city initially requiring that deposits be fully backed by metal. No fractional reserve banking being permitted, the conservative approach being deliberate, building trust through reliability, the bank's reputation depending on its ability to redeem bank money for physical coins on demand, though in practice few depositors bother to withdraw because transacting in bank money is more convenient than dealing with physical coins. The vaults beneath the town hall become legendary, supposedly containing vast quantities of silver, though exactly how much remains uncertain, the secrecy being part of the mystique, the confidence being sustained partly by the impressive physical security and the city's backing, the psychological aspects of banking, trust being as important as the physical metal. The rhythms of work at the Bank of Amsterdam follow the patterns established by earlier Italian bankers but scaled and formalized. The bank opens at set hours, the great doors being unlocked by city officials who hold the keys, the guards taking their positions, the clerks preparing their desks and retrieving ledgers from locked cabinets, the preparation being ritualistic, the routine being reliable, the predictability being reassuring to depositors who depend on the bank's regularity. Throughout the day, merchants arrive to conduct business, depositing coins or making gyro transfers, the volume of transactions being substantial, the clerks working steadily through queues of clients, each transaction being recorded carefully, the books being balanced at day's end, the nightly accounting ritual being as essential here as it was in Florence, the fundamental requirement of double entry bookkeeping being that debits equal credits, that every florin can be accounted for, that the books balance perfectly, or errors are found and corrected before the bank closes. The evening sees the vaults being checked, officials verifying that the physical metal matches the ledger records, though the process being sampling rather than complete inventory, counting every coin in the vaults being impossibly time-consuming, instead random samples being weighed and tested, the statistical approach being good enough to catch major discrepancies while being practical enough to complete before midnight. The ledgers are locked away, the vaults are sealed with multiple locks whose keys are distributed among different city officials, no single person being able to access the vaults alone, the precautions being layered and thorough, the city's treasure being protected with appropriate paranoia. The Bank of Amsterdam's success inspires imitation, other cities creating similar public banks, though none achieving the same scale and influence, Amsterdam's position as commercial hub being unique, the network effects being self-reinforcing, merchants wanting to bank where other merchants bank, the concentration of financial activity creating liquidity and efficiency that smaller institutions cannot match. The bank continues operating successfully for 2 centuries, eventually failing in the late 18th century, when the Dutch East India Company, to which the bank had secretly lent large sums, violating its conservative reserve requirements, encounters financial difficulties, the revelation that the legendary vaults are not fully stocked, creating a crisis of confidence. The lesson being that even public banks backed by cities can fail if they abandon prudent practices, if they secretly take risks that undermine their public promises, if trust is betrayed, though this failure lies far in the future during the bank's 17th century golden age, when it represents banking at its most stable and successful. Remember those Medici clerks balancing private ledgers by candlelight. Now a public institution performs the same functions in stone vaults beneath a city hall, the transition from private profit to civic service being significant, the implications for how banking can be organised being profound. Time moves forward again. You now find yourself across the North Sea in London, in the last decade of the 17th century, 1694 specifically, witnessing the creation of an institution that will become even more influential than the Bank of Amsterdam, though its origins are more controversial, its character being more ambiguous, neither purely private nor purely public, but rather a hybrid that will become the model for central banking worldwide. England in 1694 is at war with France, the 9 Years' War being expensive, King William III needing to fund armies and navies, the cost exceeding what traditional taxation can provide, the government needing to borrow but finding that its credit is poor, previous monarchs having defaulted on debts, lenders being reluctant to trust promises of future repayment from a government with a history of breaking such promises. The solution being proposed is ingenious, creating a bank that will lend to the government while also conducting private banking business. The bank's success depending on the government honouring its debts, creating aligned incentives, the private shareholders of the bank having reasons to pressure the government to maintain its credit. The Bank of England is chartered by Parliament, granted monopoly privileges, including the exclusive right to issue banknotes in exchange for lending £1.2 million to the government at 8% interest, the loan being substantial, nearly the entire initial capital of the bank. The close connection between the bank and government being built into its structure from the beginning. The shareholders are wealthy merchants and landowners, people with capital to invest and political influence to protect their investment. The bank being private in ownership but public in function, the ambiguity being deliberate, creating flexibility while maintaining accountability to both shareholders and government. Imagine you visit the Bank of England in its early years, the late 1690s, the institution being housed in Mercer's Hall initially before constructing its own premises on Threadneedle Street, the building that will eventually expand to occupy an entire city block, becoming architectural symbol of British financial power, the fortress-like exterior walls being windowless at ground level, the security being as important as the aesthetic, though both serving to inspire confidence in the institution's permanence and reliability. The banking hall is impressive, high ceilings supported by classical columns, marble floors worn smooth by the feet of countless merchants and bankers over decades. The atmosphere being one of restrained grandeur, the English preference for understatement being visible in the architecture, the message being quiet confidence rather than ostentatious display. The main room where public business is conducted is called the Stock Office, the name reflecting one of the bank's key functions, managing government debt, the national debt being in the form of stock certificates representing loans to the Crown, the interest being paid regularly, the debt itself being perpetual, the government borrowing being permanent feature of national finance rather than temporary emergency measure. The clerks at the Bank of England work at tall mahogany desks arranged in rows, their clothing being formal, dark coats and waistcoats, the dress code reflecting the bank's serious character, the employees being expected to embody respectability and trustworthiness, their appearance being part of the bank's brand, their behaviour being monitored for any hint of impropriety or excess, the bank's reputation depending on public confidence, which depends partly on the visible propriety of its operations and staff. The innovation that makes the Bank of England historically crucial is its issuance of paper currency, banknotes being promises to pay gold on demand but circulating as money themselves. The paper being easier to handle than coins for large transactions, lighter to transport, simpler to count, the convenience being obvious despite initial public scepticism about paper money. The cultural adjustment required to trust paper as equivalent to gold being substantial but gradually accepted as the bank proves reliable in honouring its redemption promises. The early banknotes are impressive documents, printed on high-quality paper with elaborate engraved borders, each note being numbered and dated, signed by bank cashiers whose handwriting is distinctive and difficult to forge, the amounts being filled in by hand for specific transactions, initially standardized printed denominations coming later, as volume increases and the need for convenience outweighs personalization. The watermarks in the paper are visible when held to light, the paper being specially manufactured to make counterfeiting difficult, multiple security features being layered to protect the bank's promises from forgery. though counterfeiters nonetheless managed to produce false notes, the penalties for counterfeiting being death by hanging, the severity being proportional to the threat that false currency poses to trust in the monetary system. You watch as a merchant receives payment in banknotes rather than gold, the scene being commonplace now, but having been revolutionary when first introduced, the merchant examining the notes carefully, checking the signatures and paper quality, holding them to the light to see the watermarks, the verification being necessary because accepting a false note means losing the entire value, no recourse being available if you've been deceived. The merchant, satisfied that the notes are genuine, folds them carefully and places them in an inner pocket, the bulk being minimal compared to equivalent value in gold coins, the convenience being what drives adoption despite the risks. The Bank of England's relationship with government is complex and evolving, the bank financing government debt by purchasing bonds, the government debt being converted into bank assets that back the note issue, the arrangement meaning that the government's borrowing creates the money supply, the bank's profits coming partly from interest on government bonds, the mutual dependency being the foundation of the system. The danger, already visible to contemporary observers, is that government might exploit this relationship by excessive borrowing, inflating the currency, using newly created money to fund expenditures without raising taxes, the temptation being enormous, the restraint depending on political will and economic understanding, both being sometimes lacking. The bank gradually accumulates other functions beyond note issue and government finance, becoming the bank where other banks keep reserves, where they turn for loans during liquidity shortages, where clearing between banks occurs, the evolution towards central banking being organic, driven by practical needs rather than deliberate design. The concept of lender of last resort emerges slowly through crisis response, the bank providing emergency loans to troubled banks during panics, preventing individual failures from cascading into system-wide collapse. Though the bank's willingness to help being inconsistent initially, each crisis prompting debate about whether rescue is appropriate or creates moral hazard by encouraging recklessness. Decades pass, the 18th century preceding, banking spreading throughout Britain and across Europe, more institutions being founded, more money being created through credit, the system becoming more sophisticated but also more complex, more interconnected and therefore potentially more fragile, the benefits being clear in economic growth and commercial expansion, the costs being periodic crises that disrupt prosperity and destroy wealth. You now find yourself contemplating fractional reserve banking as it becomes formalized and widespread in the late 18th and 19th centuries, the practice that creates money through lending, that makes banking profitable but dangerous, that enables economic growth but creates instability. The mechanics are simple, but the implications profound. A bank accepts deposits, perhaps 10,000 gold sovereigns, and rather than keeping all this gold idle in vaults, lends most of it, perhaps 9,000 sovereigns, to borrowers, keeping only 1,000 as reserve against withdrawals. The depositors still believe they have 10,000 sovereigns available, their account balances unchanged, their ability to write cheques unaffected by the loans the bank has made. The borrowers now have 9,000 sovereigns to spend or invest. The money supply has grown from 10,000 to 19,000 sovereigns, even though only 10,000 physical gold coins exist, the bank having created 9,000 sovereigns through lending, the creation being legal and beneficial, enabling economic activity that couldn't occur if all deposits remained locked in vaults, but also creating vulnerability because the bank cannot honour all deposits simultaneously, its promises exceeding its resources, the system depending on depositors, not all demanding withdrawal at once. This works smoothly when confidence prevails, when depositors trust the bank's solvency, when economic conditions are stable, the daily flow of deposits and withdrawals roughly balancing, the fractional reserve being adequate for normal operations. But any shock can trigger a run, depositors rushing to withdraw before the gold runs out, the bank depleting its reserves, paying early withdrawals, closing its doors when reserves are exhausted, the remaining depositors losing everything, their account balances being revealed as empty promises, the paper records of deposits being worthless without gold to back them. The 19th century sees this pattern repeating with disturbing regularity. Roughly every 10 to 20 years, the cycle becoming almost predictable. Economic expansion leads to optimistic lending. Borrowers take on more debt. Speculation increases, asset prices rise, more credit being extended against inflated collateral, the boom feeding on itself, everyone profiting, the good times seeming permanent. Then something triggers doubt. Perhaps a major merchant fails, a crop failure reduces income, a foreign market closes, a war begins. Whatever the trigger, confidence begins eroding, lenders becoming cautious, borrowers finding credit scarce, some businesses failing because they cannot refinance short-term debts, those failures causing more caution, more credit restriction, the downward spiral beginning. You find yourself in London in October 1825, standing outside a bank in the financial district, watching a queue of depositors extending down the street, the people being merchants and tradesmen mostly, respectable citizens whose savings are deposited here, whose businesses depend on this bank, who fear losing everything if the bank fails. The queue moves slowly, the bank's doors remaining open, but tellers counting gold deliberately, trying to maintain calm while reserves deplete steadily. The senior partners consulting in back rooms, calculating whether they can survive this run, sending messengers to other banks seeking loans, attempting to sell assets for gold, the scramble being desperate, even while maintaining outward composure. The scene is calm but melancholy, not violent but inexorable, the mathematics being unforgiving. Fractional reserves cannot withstand everyone withdrawing simultaneously. The bank will fail not because its investments are bad, but because its promises exceed its gold, the structure making failure inevitable once the run begins. The only question being whether other banks will lend enough gold to survive until panic subsides and deposits resume. The interdependence of banks meaning that failures spread, each collapse weakening others, the whole system being vulnerable to cascading failures. The Bank of England faces difficult decisions during these crises, the debates being intense about whether to lend to failing banks, whether providing emergency gold will stop the panic or simply delay inevitable failures, whether banks making poor decisions should be rescued or allowed to fail as market discipline, the arguments on both sides being reasonable. Walter Bagehot, writing after observing many crises, will eventually articulate the principle that central banks should lend freely at high interest rates to solvent but illiquid banks during panics, providing liquidity without rewarding imprudence, the rule becoming doctrine, though its application remaining difficult and contentious. The crises come in waves throughout the century: 1825, 1837, 1847, 1857, 1866, 1873, 1893, each having particular triggers and circumstances, but all following similar patterns, the repetition being evidence of structural problems rather than isolated accidents, the fractional reserve system creating inherent instability. The question being whether this instability is acceptable price for credit creation's benefits, or whether reforms can reduce crisis frequency and severity while preserving banking's economic functions. The human cost of these crises extends far beyond bankers and depositors. The failures triggering recessions affecting entire economies, businesses closing, workers losing jobs, families losing savings and homes, the suffering being widespread and prolonged, recovery taking years, the social damage being substantial even when measured purely in economic terms, the psychological trauma being harder to quantify but equally real. Yet banking continues expanding, new banks emerging after each crisis, depositors returning when confidence rebuilds, borrowers seeking credit when opportunities appear, the demand for banking services being so strong that periodic disasters cannot suppress growth, the long-term trend being expansion despite short-term setbacks. The 20th century begins with banking still largely unregulated, still vulnerable to panics, still lacking reliable institutional backstops. The panic of 1907 in the United States becomes the catalyst for creating the Federal Reserve System, the crisis being severe enough that even opponents of central banking recognize that something must change, that repeated crises are unacceptable, that modern economies require monetary management rather than pure laissez-faire. You now find yourself in Washington, D.C. in 1913 as Congress debates the Federal Reserve Act, the culmination of years of study and political negotiation following the 1907 crisis. The structure being proposed is characteristically American, neither the fully centralized Bank of England model nor pure decentralization, instead being a federation of 12 regional reserve banks coordinated through a Federal Reserve Board in Washington, the compromise attempting to balance competing concerns about concentrated power versus coordinated policy, private control versus public accountability, regional autonomy versus national uniformity. Imagine visiting the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in its early years, the building on Liberty Street being impressive, designed to project strength and permanence. The architecture being Renaissance palazzo style, massive sandstone blocks, fortress-like appearance, the 5 floors above ground being substantial, but the real strength being below ground, the vaults extending several stories beneath the building, eventually becoming the world's largest gold repository, apart from Fort Knox, foreign central banks storing their gold reserves there for safety and convenience. The vault itself is remarkable, descending to bedrock 90 feet below street level, the vault door weighing 90 tons, operated by compressed air cylinders, requiring multiple keys and combinations held by different officials, the security being as elaborate as human ingenuity can devise, the gold being stored in compartments assigned to different nations, each country's reserves being physically separated, the accountants tracking ownership but the metal remaining in place, international gold transfers being accomplished by moving gold between compartments rather than physically shipping it, the efficiency being typical of modern banking's evolution toward paper and electronic records while maintaining some physical foundation. The operations of the Federal Reserve are different from commercial banking, the Fed not taking deposits from individuals or making commercial loans to businesses, instead being the banker's bank, providing services to commercial banks, implementing monetary policy to manage the economy, the wholesale level operations being removed from public view, the retail banking being left to commercial banks who maintain direct customer relationships, the two-tier system being standard in modern banking worldwide. The Fed's tools for managing the economy are several, the most important being control over interest rates through the discount window where banks can borrow from the Fed, the discount rate influencing all other interest rates, lower rates encouraging borrowing and spending, higher rates discouraging it, the Fed attempting to smooth economic cycles, preventing excessive booms and softening recessions, the ambition being substantial, the execution being uncertain, the debates about proper monetary policy continuing for decades, each generation of economists proposing different theories, each financial crisis revealing new complications, different theories, The discount window embodies the lender of last resort function, banks being able to borrow from the Fed during liquidity crises, the availability of this backup reducing panic, the knowledge that solvent banks can get emergency funding if depositors run calming depositors themselves, making runs less likely. The stabilizing effect being real, though imperfect, moral hazard remaining concern. Banks potentially taking excessive risks if they expect Fed rescue. The balance between stability and discipline being difficult to achieve. The Federal Reserve also manages the currency supply through open market operations, buying government bonds to inject money into the economy, selling bonds to withdraw money, the purchases being made with newly created money, keystrokes adding reserves to bank accounts. The magic of modern central banking being that money is created through accounting entries rather than printing presses or gold mines, the constraint being inflation rather than physical scarcity. The challenge being using this power wisely rather than allowing political pressures to create too much money, debasing the currency, destroying its value through inflation. Remember those medieval Florentine ledgers tracking every florin by candlelight? Now central banks create billions with keystrokes. The evolution from physical gold to paper promises to electronic entries being complete, money having become pure abstraction backed by government authority and public trust rather than precious metal. The system working because people believe it works. Confidence being the foundation, as it always has been. The technology changing, but the fundamental requirement of trust remaining constant across 7 centuries of banking evolution. The 20th century will see further evolution, the abandonment of gold backing entirely, the development of complex financial instruments and global markets, the emergence of new crises requiring new responses, the patient work of banking continuing through depression and war and prosperity, the institutions adapting, the system proving resilient, if not perfectly stable. The long story being one of gradual progress, punctuated by periodic setbacks, the rhythm being almost expected, almost comfortable in its familiarity, the eternal human challenge of managing money and credit, continuing generation after generation, crisis after crisis, innovation after innovation, the slow accumulation of wisdom and technique allowing the system to serve growing populations and economies despite persistent problems and recurring failures. The work continuing, the evolution proceeding, the story moving forward toward the present and beyond. Time moves forward through the 20th century, through the Great Depression and World Wars, through the establishment of the Bretton Woods system after 1944, tying world currencies to the dollar and the dollar to gold, the post-war economic order being built on this foundation of convertibility, nations being able to exchange dollars for gold at fixed rates, the system providing stability for international trade and finance. Though the strains are growing, the United States accumulating obligations that exceed its gold reserves, the mathematics becoming unsustainable, the question being not whether the system will end, but when and how. You now find yourself in August 1971, the summer evening being warm in Washington, the Nixon administration preparing to announce a decision that will fundamentally transform the nature of money, ending the last connection between currency and precious metal that has existed in various forms for thousands of years, completing the evolution from gold to paper to pure abstraction that began in those medieval Florentine counting houses where clerks recorded florins in careful Latin script. The patient work of 7 centuries culminating in this moment when money becomes entirely what we agree it is, backed by nothing except government authority and collective trust. President Nixon appears on television on Sunday evening, August 15th, announcing that the United States is suspending convertibility of dollars to gold, the technical details being complex but the implication being clear. The dollar is no longer redeemable for gold. Foreign central banks holding dollars cannot exchange them for metal. The link being severed, money becoming fiat currency, valuable, because the government declares it valuable, because people accept it in payment, because the system continues functioning based on confidence rather than physical backing. The immediate reaction being surprisingly muted, markets adjusting, exchange rates floating, the feared collapse not materializing, the system adapting to the new reality with less disruption than many predicted, though inflation accelerates in subsequent years, the discipline that gold imposed being removed, governments being able to create money without physical constraints, the temptation to inflate being strong, the 1970s seeing substantial inflation in many countries, the lesson being that fiat currency requires institutional discipline to maintain value, the Federal Reserve and other central banks having to learn new techniques for managing purely paper money, the learning curve being steep, the mistakes being costly, but the system surviving, adapting, evolving. Imagine standing in the Federal Reserve's main computer room in the late 1970s, the technology being primitive, by later standards but revolutionary compared to ledger books. The massive mainframe computers filling climate-controlled rooms, tape drives spinning, punch cards being fed through readers, the electronic accounting beginning to replace paper records, though the fundamental function remaining unchanged, recording who owns what, tracking deposits and loans, balancing accounts, the technology changing, but the purpose being the same as those Florentine clerks with quill pens, maintaining accurate records, ensuring debits equal credits, preserving trust through transparent accounting. The hum of the computers is constant, a low electrical sound mixed with the whir of cooling fans, the air conditioning maintaining precise temperature and humidity levels, the machines being sensitive to heat and moisture, requiring controlled environments, the cost being substantial but necessary, the investment in technology being worthwhile for the speed and accuracy it provides. A single computer processing more transactions in an hour than dozens of clerks could manage in a day, though the employment effects being concerning, the automation eliminating many traditional banking jobs, creating new technical positions but displacing workers who lack relevant skills, the social disruption being real even as efficiency improves. The transition from gold to pure fiat currency enables expansion of banking services and money creation that would have been impossible under gold standard constraints. The 1980s and 1990s seeing explosive growth in financial services, new products being developed, traditional banking being transformed, the simple deposit and loan model being layered with complexity, securitization, and derivatives and structured products, creating intricate webs of obligations and risks that even sophisticated bankers struggle to fully understand. The system becoming so complex that no individual comprehends it entirely. The collective understanding being fragmented across specialists, each knowing their piece but none seeing the whole picture. You find yourself in a modern bank branch in the 1990s, perhaps a suburban location serving middle-class customers, the branch being cleaner and brighter than the marble halls of the Bank of England or the stone vaults of Amsterdam, fluorescent lights illuminating plastic and laminate surfaces, the aesthetic being efficiency rather than grandeur, function rather than intimidation, the democratization of banking being visible in the casual atmosphere, customers in jeans and t-shirts conducting transactions that would have required formal dress and appointments in earlier eras, banking having become routine consumer service rather than elite privilege. The teller stations are equipped with computer terminals, green monochrome screens displaying account information, keyboards clicking as tellers process deposits and withdrawals, the transactions being recorded electronically, the paper deposit slips being retained for backup, but the authoritative record being in the computer database. the shift from paper to electronic being well advanced though not yet complete, the transition period creating redundancy, both systems being maintained until confidence in the electronic records is absolute. The ATM in the lobby represents another innovation. Automated teller machines allowing customers to withdraw cash and check balances without human interaction, the convenience being valued by customers even though it reduces personal service. The 24-hour availability being revolutionary, banking being no longer constrained by branch hours, the machine dispensing crisp new $20 bills at midnight as easily as at noon, the mechanical reliability being impressive, the occasional malfunction being frustrating, but rare enough not to undermine overall trust. You watch as a customer uses the ATM, inserting a plastic card into the slot, the magnetic stripe being read by the machine, the account being accessed through telephone lines connecting to the bank's central computers, the authentication being password-based, the 4-digit PIN being primitive security but adequate for the era, the customer pressing buttons to request $40, the machine making mechanical sounds as it counts bills and prepares the dispense, the cash emerging from the slot, the receipt being printed with transaction details, the whole process taking less than a minute, the speed and convenience being remarkable compared to waiting in teller queues, though the impersonal nature being noted by some customers who miss human interaction, the trade-off between efficiency and service being characteristic of modern banking's evolution. The products available at this 1990s bank extend far beyond simple checking and savings accounts. The menu of services having expanded dramatically, credit cards being universal, mortgages being offered with complex terms and structures, home equity lines of credit, auto loans, personal loans, certificates of deposit with various maturities and interest rates, money market accounts, investment services through affiliated brokerages, insurance products, retirement accounts, the one-stop financial services model being the goal, capturing all of a customer's financial needs, building relationships that generate multiple revenue streams, the diversification being profitable for banks but also creating complexity for customers who struggle to understand the terms and implications of various products being offered. The credit card in your wallet represents a revolution in consumer finance, the piece of plastic allowing purchases on credit, the balance being paid monthly or carried forward with interest charges, the convenience being obvious, the dangers being less so, the ease of spending money you don't have being seductive, consumer debt levels rising through the 1980s and 1990s, household balance sheets becoming leveraged, the personal financial management skills required to use credit responsibly being unevenly distributed, some consumers benefiting from credit access while others spiral into debt, the banks profiting from interest charges regardless, the incentive structure favouring credit expansion rather than prudent lending. The mortgage market has been transformed by securitization, the innovation allowing banks to bundle home loans into securities that are sold to investors, the bank originating the loan no longer holding it until maturity, instead selling it into secondary markets, receiving immediate cash that can be lent again, the velocity of lending increasing dramatically, the risk being transferred from banks to investors who buy mortgage-backed securities, the separation between origination and risk retention creating what will eventually be recognized as dangerous incentive misalignment. But in the prosperous 1990s and early 2000s, the system seems to work beautifully, housing prices rising steadily, defaults being rare, investors eager to buy mortgage securities, the virtuous cycle continuing until it doesn't, the eventual crisis being visible in retrospect, but not to most participants during the boom. Remember those medieval Italian bankers carefully assessing borrowers' character before lending? Now, mortgage brokers are paid commissions for originating loans they immediately sell, the incentive being volume rather than quality. The deterioration of lending standards being gradual but cumulative, the eventual consequences being catastrophic. But we're not there yet in this 1990s scene, the problems being building but not yet visible, the system appearing healthy even as vulnerabilities accumulate beneath the surface. Banking regulation evolves through the 20th century, responses to crises creating new rules and oversight mechanisms, the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, separating commercial banking from investment banking after the Great Depression, the reasoning being that mixing the two created conflicts of interest and excessive risk-taking. Commercial banks holding deposits should not gamble those deposits in securities markets, the separation being maintained for 6 decades, becoming article of faith among reformers, though the banking industry lobbying continuously for repeal, arguing that the restrictions prevent American banks from competing globally, that modern risk management makes the old prohibitions unnecessary. The debate continuing through decades until the law is repealed in 1999, the timing being unfortunate, occurring just as financial innovation is creating new risks that existing regulations don't address. The removal of constraints allowing merger of commercial and investment banking just as the housing bubble is inflating, the combination being volatile. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, created in 1933, represents enduring regulatory success, ensuring deposits up to specified limits, protecting ordinary depositors from bank failures, the insurance being funded by premiums paid by banks, the fund being available to reimburse depositors when banks fail, the effect being dramatic reduction in bank runs. Depositors knowing their money is safe regardless of bank performance. The confidence being justified by decades of reliable insurance payments, the FDIC becoming trusted institution, the coverage being increased periodically, the current limit being $250,000 per depositor per institution. The protection being comprehensive for ordinary depositors, though not covering wealthy individuals or institutional deposits beyond the limit. The insurance creates moral hazard, banks being able to take risks knowing that depositors won't flee because deposits are protected, the risk-taking being subsidized by insurance. Though the FDIC manages this through bank examinations and capital requirements, inspectors reviewing bank portfolios, identifying problems, requiring corrective action. The supervision being mostly effective though not perfect, some banks failing despite oversight, the insurance fund occasionally being depleted and requiring replenishment. But overall, the system working, bank failures being handled smoothly, depositors being protected, the insurance being one of the New Deal's lasting successes, the benefits far outweighing the costs. You now find yourself in the early 21st century, banking having entered the digital age, computer technology having transformed operations and customer service, the physical branches becoming less important as online banking emerges. Customers accessing accounts through internet browsers, conducting transactions from home computers, paying bills electronically, transferring funds between accounts, checking balances, downloading statements. The convenience being revolutionary, the 24/7 access being valued, the reduction in branch visits being dramatic, though branches persist for complex transactions and customers who prefer personal service. The hybrid model being standard, physical and digital channels coexisting, customers choosing based on needs and preferences. Mobile banking emerges with smartphones, the apps allowing banking from anywhere. Deposits being made by photographing checks, balances being checked while shopping, transfers being made while travelling, the mobility being complete, the integration of banking into daily life being seamless, the technology being user-friendly after initial learning curves, the security being surprisingly robust despite fears about mobile vulnerabilities, fingerprint and face recognition adding authentication layers, encryption protecting data transmission, the convenience outweighing security concerns for most users, adoption being rapid, the younger generation never knowing banking that requires visiting branches or writing paper checks, the cultural change being generational. The infrastructure supporting this digital banking is vast and complex, data centers housing thousands of servers, redundant systems ensuring reliability, transactions being processed in milliseconds, records being backed up continuously across multiple locations, the architecture being designed for failure tolerance, any component being able to fail without affecting service. The engineering being sophisticated, the investment being enormous, the banks spending billions on technology infrastructure, the competitive advantage going to institutions with best systems, the technology arms race being continuous, every improvement being matched by competitors, the innovation cycle being rapid. The back office operations are increasingly automated, check processing being done by machines reading magnetic ink characters, sorting and routing checks electronically, the physical movement of paper being minimized, the clearing being electronic even when the check itself is paper. Though paper checks are declining, electronic payments being preferred, ACH transfers and wire transfers, and peer-to-peer payment apps replacing checks for many purposes, the younger generation rarely writing checks, the payment methods being digital native, the paper being legacy system maintained for older customers but being phased out gradually. The relationship between banks and customers changes fundamentally, the personal connection being lost as branch visits decline, the banker who knew your family and your business being replaced by call center representatives reading scripts, following procedures, authorized to make only limited decisions, the escalation to supervisors being necessary for anything unusual, the bureaucracy being frustrating for customers accustomed to personal service, but the efficiency gains and cost reductions being substantial for banks, the trade-off being accepted as necessary for competitive pricing, the race to the bottom on fees requiring cost reduction through automation and centralization, the personal service model being economically unsustainable except for wealthy clients who generate enough revenue to justify dedicated relationship managers. Yet even as traditional banking digitizes and consolidates, new challenges emerge from unexpected directions, cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology proposing radical alternatives to the banking system. The idea being money and payments without intermediaries, peer-to-peer transactions verified by distributed networks rather than trusted institutions, the Bitcoin white paper appearing in 2008, amid the financial crisis, the timing being symbolic, the creator Satoshi Nakamoto explicitly criticizing central banks and fractional reserve banking in the Genesis block, the cryptocurrency being designed as alternative to traditional finance, though whether it succeeds in replacing banking or merely supplements, it remains uncertain, the debate being active, the outcome being undetermined. The blockchain technology underlying Bitcoin represents genuine innovation, distributed ledger being maintained by network of computers rather than single institution, transactions being verified through cryptographic proof rather than trust in banks, the system being transparent in that all transactions are visible, though anonymous in that identities are hidden behind cryptographic addresses. The combination being novel, whether it scales to handle global payment volume being questioned, the energy consumption being enormous, the transaction throughput being limited, but the concept being influential, banks themselves exploring blockchain applications. The irony being that institutions threatened by cryptocurrency are adopting its underlying technology, the innovation being absorbed into traditional finance rather than replacing it. The pattern being familiar, banking proving remarkably resilient, adapting to incorporate threats rather than being destroyed by them. The future of banking remains uncertain, trends being visible, but outcomes being unpredictable. Central bank digital currencies being discussed, governments considering issuing digital dollars or euros or yuan that would compete with or replace physical cash and commercial bank deposits. The implications being profound, the disintermediation of commercial banks being possible. If people hold central bank digital currency directly, the restructuring of banking being potentially radical, though exactly how these systems would work remains undefined. The experiments being small-scale, the deployment being cautious, the changes being gradual rather than revolutionary despite the hype. The changes being artificial intelligence is being deployed in banking, algorithms making credit decisions, analysing spending patterns to detect fraud, providing customer service through chatbots, managing investment portfolios, the automation continuing what began with ATMs and online banking, extending into areas previously requiring human judgment, the AI being surprisingly effective for routine decisions, the error rates being acceptable, the cost savings being substantial, though concerns about bias and fairness being raised, algorithms potentially discriminating in ways that violate laws and norms. The oversight being difficult because the decision processes are opaque. The black box problem being recognised but not solved, the regulation struggling to keep pace with technology. The environmental impact of banking is being scrutinised, cryptocurrency mining consuming vast amounts of electricity, data centres requiring constant cooling, the carbon footprint being substantial, the sustainability being questioned, though banks also financing renewable energy projects, the environmental role being ambiguous, both contributing to problems and potentially helping solve them, the balance depending on choices and policies not yet fully determined, the future being malleable, influenced by decisions being made now about technology deployment and investment priorities and regulatory frameworks. It is late now, very late, the hour approaching midnight. The story has travelled far, from those Florentine counting houses with candlelight and quill pens to data centres with quantum encryption and artificial intelligence, from gold florins sorted by hand to digital currency created by algorithms, from personal trust sealed with wax to cryptographic verification, from local banking serving city merchants to global financial networks connecting billions, the journey being long, but the essential function remaining constant, recording who owns what, facilitating exchange, creating credit, managing risk, the patient work of banking, continuing through all the changes, the technology evolving, but the purpose persisting. You stand now in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York late at night, after the banking day has ended, the public areas being empty and quiet, the marble floors reflecting amber security lighting, the sound being your footsteps echoing softly in vast halls designed to accommodate crowds, but now occupied only by yourself and occasional security guards making their rounds. The atmosphere being peaceful, contemplative, the weight of history being palpable in this building where so much American and global finance is managed, where decisions affecting millions are made, where the machinery of modern money operates continuously even when humans sleep. The main banking hall is dark, except for exit signs and security lights, the teller windows being closed and shuttered, the counters being empty, the day's work being complete, the books balanced, the transactions recorded, the systems running overnight processes, batch jobs updating accounts, calculating interest, processing check clearances, the computers working tirelessly while the building sleeps, the overnight shift being skeleton crew, monitoring screens, responding to alerts, ensuring continuity. The 24-hour nature of modern banking requiring perpetual vigilance even when branch lobbies are closed. You descend stairs to the basement levels where the vault is located, passing through multiple security checkpoints, the doors being massive, the locks being elaborate, the combination required to open them being known to only a few senior officials, no single person being able to access the vault alone, the security protocols being multi-layered, the precautions being appropriate for a facility holding substantial portions of the world's gold reserves, the physical security being as sophisticated as modern technology allows, cameras monitoring approaches, motion sensors detecting movement, guards armed and trained, the protection being comprehensive. The vault door itself is an engineering marvel, 9 feet tall, steel and concrete, weighing 90 tons, operated by hydraulic cylinders, requiring multiple keys and combinations and procedures to open, designed to resist any attack that doesn't involve heavy explosives and sustained effort, the time required to breach being long enough for authorities to respond, the deterrent being effective, the vault never having been successfully robbed, the security being vindicated by decades of safe operation, though the threat continues requiring constant vigilance. Inside the vault, gold bars are stacked in compartments, each compartment being assigned to a different nation. The United States gold being separated from British gold, being separated from German gold, and so forth, the physical segregation being important for accounting and security. International gold transfers being accomplished by moving bars between compartments rather than shipping gold across oceans. The efficiency being typical of modern finance, the physical gold staying in place while the ownership records change, the paper or electronic records being what matter, the gold being almost ceremonial, backing the system psychologically more than practically. The metal sitting idle, serving primarily as confidence anchor, the value being the trust it represents rather than its industrial uses. The silence in the vault is profound, the thick walls blocking all outside sound, the air being climate-controlled, cool and dry, the conditions being optimal for metal storage, though humans find it slightly uncomfortable, the chill being noticeable after several minutes, the reminder being that this space is designed for gold rather than people. The priorities being clear in the environmental controls. Somewhere above you, in the building's upper floors, computer servers hum quietly, processing transactions, maintaining accounts, routing payments through international networks, the electronic systems operating continuously, the overnight clearing and settlement being when many large transfers occur, the interbank payments being processed, the balances being adjusted, the endless flow of money through the banking system continuing, invisible, intangible, the digital pulses representing billions of dollars moving between accounts, between banks, between countries, the global financial system functioning seamlessly, the complexity being managed through sophisticated software and telecommunications, the infrastructure being robust, the redundancy being extensive, the system rarely failing, the reliability being what allows commerce to function, trust being maintained through consistent performance. The guard makes his round, footsteps echoing in empty corridors, checking doors, verifying locks, noting his passage in the logbook, the human oversight complementing the electronic monitoring, the personal responsibility being important, even in an age of automated surveillance, the discipline being maintained, the attention being paid, the vigilance being continuous, the eternal requirement that valuable things must be guarded, that records must be maintained, that trust must be earned through reliability, the fundamental banking principles being unchanged, even as everything else transforms. You emerge from the vault level back to the main floor, the journey upward being symbolic, returning from the physical foundation of gold to the abstract realm of electronic finance, from the tangible past to the intangible present, the building containing both the old and new coexisting. the gold in the vault being historical artifact and psychological anchor, while the computers upstairs do the actual work of modern banking, the combination being characteristically modern, respecting tradition while embracing innovation, maintaining physical reserves while acknowledging that modern money is primarily information, records, trust, agreements, the social construction that we call finance. Remember those quiet Florentine evenings when clerks balanced ledgers by candlelight, the scratch of quill on parchment, the clink of gold florins being sorted? The technology has changed beyond recognition, the quills replaced by keyboards, the candles by fluorescent tubes and LED screens, the gold florins by electronic digits. But the essential work continues, recording transactions, maintaining accounts, facilitating commerce, creating credit, managing the flow of money through economies. The patient daily work of banking being as necessary now as it was 7 centuries ago. The social function being constant even as the specific mechanisms evolve. From those marble-floored Florentine counting houses where Medici clerks worked beneath frescoed ceilings, through the damp stone vaults of Amsterdam where municipal clerks maintained public accounts, through the grand halls of the Bank of England where paper currency was invented, through the regional Federal Reserve banks spreading across America, to these modern glass and steel towers housing server farms and trading floors. The evolution being continuous, the innovation being relentless, but the core being stable, banking being about trust, about record keeping, about matching those who have money with those who need it, about creating the credit that enables investment and growth, about maintaining the confidence that keeps the system functioning. The night deepens, the city outside sleeps, or at least quiets, the pace slowing, if not stopping. Inside the Federal Reserve, the systems continue processing, the transactions flowing, the money moving, the accounts updating, the invisible machinery of finance operating tirelessly. The infrastructure being so reliable that people never think about it. The ultimate success of infrastructure being that it disappears, becomes background, enables other things rather than demanding attention. Somewhere tonight, millions of people trust that their bank deposits are safe, that their money will be there in the morning, that payments will clear, that the system works, the confidence being justified by centuries of evolution, by layers of regulation and insurance and oversight, by the accumulated wisdom of generations of bankers and regulators learning from crises and adapting, by the patient daily work of maintaining records and balancing books and guarding vaults and monitoring systems, the infrastructure being human as much as technological, the reliability being achieved through discipline and procedure and redundancy and continuous effort. The great vault doors are sealed for the night. The gold sits quietly in its compartments, serving its psychological function of backing the system even though modern money long ago transcended any physical foundation. The computers process their overnight batch jobs, updating millions of accounts with interest charges and deposits and transfers. The digital records being authoritative, the paper being increasingly rare, the evolution toward pure information being nearly complete. The story ends here, in this quiet building, in this peaceful hour, the long history having brought us to this moment where money is essentially abstract, where banking is primarily digital, where trust is maintained through complex systems rather than personal relationships, where the scale is global rather than local, but where the fundamental purpose remains what it was in those Florentine counting houses, facilitating exchange, creating credit, managing risk, maintaining records, enabling commerce, the quiet essential work of finance continuing, generation after generation, crisis after crisis, innovation after innovation, the patient human effort to make economic life possible, to allow strangers to trust each other enough to trade, to allow saving and borrowing across time, to allow the accumulation and allocation of capital that makes modern prosperity possible. Rest now. The banks will open tomorrow. The tellers will count cash and process deposits. The systems will route payments and update balances. The vault will protect its gold. The Federal Reserve will manage monetary policy. The work will continue. The story goes on. But for now, in this quiet hour, in this peaceful building, in this moment between past and future, rest, sleep. The patient work of banking will continue without you. The machinery is sound. The system is functioning without you. The quiet, competent work of managing money proceeds as it has for centuries, as it will for centuries more, adapting, evolving, serving, persisting. The long story of human cooperation and trust continuing, the money flowing, the accounts balancing, the vault doors holding, the trust being maintained, the system working quietly, patiently, endlessly, the work of ages continuing while the world sleeps.